On December 31st, 2019, New Year's Eve, 28-year-old Monique Ba, a bright and ambitious real estate agent in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was preparing to show a property to what she believed was a legitimate client interested in purchasing a home. It was supposed to be a routine showing, one of many she had conducted throughout her career, but this appointment, arranged over several days of phone calls and text messages, was anything but routine. It was an elaborate trap, orchestrated by Lyndon Akeem Wiggins, a 40-year-old drug dealer and former music industry associate, and his girlfriend Elsa Segura, a Hennepin County probation officer. The fake home showing was designed to lure Monique into the hands of kidnappers, who would abduct her, drive her to her own home, where they would shoot her boyfriend in front of their 2 young daughters, and then execute Monique in a Minneapolis alley, leaving her body bound and discarded like garbage. Monique, an innocent woman whose only connection to the dispute was being in love with the wrong man, paid the ultimate price. Her murder would lead to one of Minnesota's most complex and controversial criminal trials, involving 5 defendants, overturned convictions, retrials, and ultimately life sentences for those responsible. Monique Ba was born in 1991 and grew up in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. By her late 20s, she had built a promising career as a real estate agent, earning respect from colleagues and clients for her professionalism, warmth, and dedication. Monique was known for her bright smile, her positive energy, and her genuine care for the people she worked with. She was not just selling houses, she was helping families find homes and build futures. Friends and family described her as ambitious, hardworking, and deeply devoted to her 2 young daughters, ages 3 and 1. Monique lived with her boyfriend, John Mitchell Momo, a recording artist who performed under various stage names and had been trying to establish himself in the Minneapolis music scene. The couple shared a home in Minneapolis, and by all accounts, they were building a life together, raising their daughters and pursuing their respective careers. But John Mitchell Momo had a past that would come back to haunt his family in the most tragic way imaginable. Mitchell Momo had previously been involved in the music business with Lyndon Akeem Wiggins, who presented himself as a music promoter and industry insider, but was in reality a drug dealer operating in the Twin Cities. According to prosecutors, Wiggins and Mitchell Momo had a falling out related to the drug trade. Wiggins believed that Mitchell Momo had cooperated with law enforcement, had snitched on Wiggins or others in their circle, a betrayal that Wiggins could not forgive. In the criminal underworld, being labeled a snitch is a death sentence, and Wiggins was determined to exact revenge. But rather than targeting Mitchell Momo directly, Wiggins devised a plan that would strike at the heart of what Mitchell Momo loved most: his family. Lyndon Akeem Wiggins, also known by the alias Lyndon Swarn, was born around 1985 and had a lengthy criminal history involving drug trafficking and violence. By 2019, Wiggins was in his mid-30s and deeply entrenched in the drug trade, operating in Minneapolis and the surrounding suburbs. He presented himself as a music industry figure, someone with connections and influence, but his real business was selling drugs. Wiggins was known among associates as ruthless, manipulative, and willing to use violence to settle scores. He had multiple romantic relationships, including with Elsa Segura, a Hennepin County probation officer who would become a key co-conspirator in the murder plot. Segura's involvement in the crime was particularly shocking. She was a law enforcement professional, someone entrusted with supervising offenders and ensuring public safety, yet she willingly participated in a kidnapping and murder scheme orchestrated by her criminal boyfriend. Elsa Segura was approximately 30 years old in 2019 and had been working as a probation officer in Hennepin County. She met Lyndon Wiggins through unknown circumstances, and the two began a romantic relationship. Segura was aware of Wiggins' criminal activities but chose to remain involved with him. When Wiggins began planning his revenge against John Mitchell Momo, Segura agreed to play a critical role in the scheme. Her involvement would ultimately cost her career, her freedom, and her reputation. In addition to Wiggins, Segura, the plot involved 3 other co-conspirators: Cedric Lamont Berry, Barry Alexander Davis, and Shantae Berry. Cedric Berry and Barry Davis were both 42 years old in 2019 and had criminal backgrounds. They were recruited by Wiggins to carry out the kidnapping and shootings. Shantae Berry, who was Davis's sister and Cedric Berry's wife, played a supporting role by helping the men evade capture after the crimes. The plan was meticulously orchestrated over several days. On December 29th and 30th, 2019, Elsa Segura used a burner phone, a prepaid phone purchased by Cedric Berry specifically to avoid detection, to call and text Monique Baugh. Segura posed as a potential home buyer named Lisa, expressing interest in viewing a vacant property for sale in Maple Grove, a suburb northwest of Minneapolis. Monique, believing she was dealing with a legitimate client, agreed to meet Lisa at the property on December 31st, 2019, for a showing. The address was 7100 Forest View Lane North in Maple Grove, a house that was legitimately listed for sale, but would serve as the location for Monique's abduction. On the morning of December 31st, 2019, Monique left her home in Minneapolis and drove to the Maple Grove property for the scheduled showing. She arrived at approximately 11 a.m. expecting to meet her client. But Lisa never showed up. Instead, Cedric Berry and Barry Davis were waiting for her. As Monique entered the vacant home or stood outside waiting for her client, the two men attacked. They overpowered Monique, bound her hands and face with duct tape, and forced her into the cargo area of a U-Haul truck that had been rented for the kidnapping. Monique was now a prisoner, terrified and helpless, as the men drove her away from the property. But the plan did not end with Monique's kidnapping. Wiggins had ordered Barry and Davis to use Monique to gain access to her home where John Mitchell Momo would be. The men drove the U-Haul from Maple Grove back to Minneapolis in the early afternoon. One of the men took Monique's house key, which they had taken from her during the abduction, and entered the home. Inside, John Mitchell Momo was with his two young daughters, ages 3 and 1. The masked gunman confronted Mitchell Momo and opened fire, shooting him multiple times with a .45 caliber pistol in front of the terrified children. Mitchell Momo collapsed, critically wounded, but managed to survive long enough to call for help. The gunmen fled the scene, returning to the U-Haul where Monique remained bound and trapped. The men then drove Monique to a secluded alley in Minneapolis. There, in a final act of cruelty, they executed her. Monique was shot 3 times, including once in the face at point-blank range with the same gun used to shoot Mitchell Momo. Her body was left in the alley, her hands still bound with duct tape, discarded like refuse. The men then drove away in the U-Haul, believing they had successfully carried out the Wiggins revenge plot. Emergency responders arrived at John Mitchell Momo's home shortly after the shooting. He was rushed to a hospital with life-threatening injuries, but survived, though he would carry the physical and emotional scars of the attack for the rest of his life. His 2 young daughters, who had witnessed their father being shot, were unharmed physically, but traumatized by what they had seen. Police immediately launched an investigation, treating the shooting as an attempted murder and recognizing that it was likely connected to a larger criminal conspiracy. Hours later, on the evening of December 31st, 2019, Monique Baugh's body was discovered in the alley. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators quickly connected the 2 incidents, the shooting of John Mitchell Momo and the murder of Monique Baugh, and determined they were part of a coordinated attack. The investigation intensified as detectives worked to identify the perpetrators and understand the motive behind the crimes. Forensic evidence and witness statements began to paint a picture. Police recovered the U-Haul truck used in the kidnapping and found zip ties and 4 pink press-on fingernails in the back of the truck, evidence that someone had been confined there and had struggled to escape. Cell phone records revealed the burner phone used to contact Monique, and investigators traced it back to Cedric Berry's purchase. Surveillance footage from the Maple Grove property and surrounding areas captured images of the U-Haul and the suspects. Witnesses came forward with information about Lyndon Wiggins' threats against Mitchell Momo and his desire for revenge. On January 3, 2020, just days after the murder, police arrested Lyndon Akeem Wiggins, Elsa Segura, Cedric Berry, Barry Davis, and Shantae Berry. All 5 were charged in connection with the kidnapping, murder, and attempted murder. The charges were severe: aiding and abetting first-degree premeditated murder, aiding and abetting first-degree premeditated attempted murder, aiding and abetting kidnapping, and aiding and abetting first-degree felony murder while committing kidnapping. In June 2021, Cedric Berry and Barry Davis stood trial in Hennepin County District Court. The prosecution, led by the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, presented an overwhelming case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, cell phone records, and surveillance footage. The jury heard how Barry and Davis had kidnapped Monique, shot Mitchell Momo in front of his children, and executed Monique in an alley. The defense attempted to argue that the men were merely following orders and that Lyndon Riggins was the true mastermind, but the jury was not swayed. On June 3, 2021, after deliberating, the jury found Cedric Berry and Barry Davis guilty on all 4 counts. Judge Peter Cahill sentenced both men to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Barry and Davis, both 42 years old at the time of sentencing, would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Shantae Berry, who had helped her brother and husband evade capture after the crimes, pled guilty to aiding an offender and received a probationary sentence, avoiding prison time. In late 2021, Elsa Segura stood trial for her role in the crimes. The prosecution argued that Segura had knowingly and willingly participated in the kidnapping plot by luring Monique to the fake home showing. Segura's defense attorneys attempted to portray her as a victim of Lyndon Wiggins' manipulation, but the evidence showed that she had made deliberate choices and taken active steps to facilitate the crime. The jury found Segura guilty, and she was sentenced to life in prison. In 2022, Lyndon Akeem Wiggins, the mastermind behind the plot, stood trial. The prosecution presented evidence that Wiggins had orchestrated every aspect of the crime, recruiting the kidnappers, providing the burner phone, coordinating with Segura, and ordering the attacks on both Monique and Mitchell Momo. Wiggins' motive was clear: revenge against a man he believed had snitched on him. The jury found Wiggins guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the legal saga was far from over. In 2024, the Minnesota Supreme Court issued a shocking ruling. The convictions of both Lyndon Wiggins and Elsa Segura were reversed due to incorrect jury instructions given during their trials. The court determined that the trial judge had materially misstated the law when instructing the jury on aiding and abetting liability, potentially allowing the jury to convict the defendants based on the actions of others without properly considering their individual culpability. The court ruled that this error was not harmless and ordered new trials for both Wiggins and Segura. The convictions of Cedric Berry and Barry Davis, however, were upheld, as the Supreme Court found that the jury instructions in their trial were correct. Elsa Segura faced the prospect of a retrial, but on September 24, 2024, she chose to accept a plea deal rather than go through another trial. She pled guilty to 1 count of kidnapping, to commit great bodily harm or terrorize. The plea agreement called for an upward departure from Minnesota's sentencing guidelines based on the particular cruelty of the crime and the involvement of 3 or more perpetrators. Segura was sentenced to 240 months, 20 years, in state prison. At her sentencing hearing, Hennepin County Attorney Moriarty stated, "Elsa Segura played a significant role in the murder of Monique Baugh, and her 20-year prison sentence is one that we believe holds her accountable for her actions. Our hearts continue to be with Ms. Baugh's family as they are undoubtedly still grieving her loss, knowing that nothing can bring her back." Landon Wiggins, Akeem Wiggins, however, refused to accept a plea deal and demanded a retrial. His retrial began in October 2025, nearly 6 years after Monique's murder. The prosecution once again presented its case, this time with corrected jury instructions that properly explained the legal standard for aiding and abetting liability. Elsa Segura testified against her former boyfriend, providing critical details about the planning and execution of the crime. Prosecutors emphasize Wiggins's role as the mastermind, the man who conceived the plot, recruited the participants, and ordered the murders on both Monique and Mitchell Momo. On November 4th, 2025, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. Lyndon Akeem Wiggins was convicted of aiding and abetting first-degree premeditated murder, aiding and abetting first-degree premeditated attempted murder, aiding and abetting kidnapping to commit great bodily harm or terrorize, and aiding and abetting first-degree murder while committing the crime of kidnapping. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hennepin County Attorney Moriarty praised the verdict, stating, "Monique's family has waited nearly 6 years for the cases against all defendants to conclude. Mr. Wiggins played a primary role in Monique's death, and he is being held accountable. My thoughts are with Monique's family, and I want to express my gratitude to the jury for their service and to our trial team for securing this conviction." Wiggins' sentencing was scheduled for November 13th, 2025, but was delayed after his defense team filed a motion for a new trial, arguing various procedural errors. As of December 2025, Wiggins remains in custody at the Hennepin County Jail, awaiting sentencing, though the outcome is certain. He will receive a life sentence without parole and will die in prison. John Mitchell Momo survived the shooting, but carries permanent physical and emotional scars. He has not spoken publicly about the case, but those close to him say he struggles daily with the trauma of being shot in front of his daughters and losing the mother of his children. His daughters, now school-aged, have received counseling and support, but the impact of witnessing their father's shooting and losing their mother will stay with them forever. Monique's family has been vocal in their grief and their calls for justice. Her father, Frank Baugh, attended every day of the trials and expressed frustration at the defendant's lack of remorse. "He wasn't sincere at all," Frank Baugh said of Cedric Berry's testimony. "No remorse, no nothing." Monique's family has worked to keep her memory alive, sharing stories of her kindness, her ambition, and her love for her daughters. They have also advocated for greater protections for real estate agents, who often work alone and meet strangers in isolated properties, making them vulnerable to violence. The case of Lyndon Wiggins and the murder of Monique Baugh exposes the deadly intersection of revenge, organized crime, and innocent victims caught in the crossfire. It highlights the dangers faced by real estate professionals and the lengths to which criminals will go to settle scores. It also raises troubling questions about how a probation officer could become complicit in such a heinous crime. As of December 2025, all 4 primary defendants remain incarcerated. Cedric Berry and Barry Davis are serving life sentences without parole. Elsa Segura is serving a 20-year sentence and will be eligible for release in 2044. Lyndon Wiggins awaits sentencing but will receive a life sentence without parole. Monique's legacy lives on through her daughters and through the reforms her case has inspired. See you in the next one.